Hello there, and welcome to the next OmniFood section, which is the section on the sample meals. And once more, I did a sketch for this section before actually building it and designing it as well. And so I want this section to look a little bit like this. So first, we are going to have two cart components here, and one for each of the meals that was provided to us in the initial content. So these meal cards are going to be a bit inspired by these two examples that are here on the right side. So basically having a photo or an image at the top, then the name of the meal, and then below that there's going to be the data about the meal. And so for each of the data points, I also want to include an icon there. So this is going to be the first time we will use some icons in this project, and so that's going to be fun as well. And yeah, so we have here these two cards, as I just mentioned, and then besides that, we're going to include the list of diets that are compatible with the OmniFood application. So here, again, we're going to use our grid, and we will have 3 columns, just as we see here. Okay, so does that sound good? Well, then let's get started building this. And as always, let's start by adding a new section right after the previous one. So a new section element, and this one I'm going to call it the section meals. Okay, and then just like before, we also want that same subheading and also the heading itself. So basically, just this here. So we can just copy this entire, let's call it a component, and then paste that here. Okay, and I think that in our content, we actually already have the title for this meals section, and so that's this one. So let's just copy that, and yeah, put that here. And this section here could be called sample meals, so this, but actually I prefer to simply call it meals. So quick and short, that makes it very easy to understand what this section is all about. Okay, so that was easy, but now let's create basically our next container here, because of course we also want the next piece of content to be centered. And as I just mentioned during the sketch, we also want this to be a grid with 3 columns, right? And so we use our reusable grid here, and we use that grid class, which has the 3 columns. So which we also set up in one of the previous lectures where we created this reusable grid. Remember that? And so here, let's now create the 2 meal cards and then that list. So meal, and let's copy this again using the Option or Alt Shift down shortcut. And actually once again, so that here we just have to replace this with a list, let's say. So this is going to be the list of diets. So I'm just writing this here right now, just so we can see it in the website, the web page. Okay, so let's see. And indeed, there we go. So we have our 3 columns here side by side already. And so now let's start by filling them up. All right. So basically just designing and building here the very first card so that we can then copy it here into the second column. But first of all, let's actually add some padding to this section so that we can actually see what's going on. So I'm gonna copy all of this, even that CSS code there. So meals section, and then the section meals, because the padding might be exactly the same as before, so that we maintain the same consistency. Okay, and so now we have some good spacing between these sections and can now start building our very first card component right here. Okay, so remember the first thing that we want in this card is the image, right? So image source, and then as always, it is inside of our image folder, then slash, and then down here you see we have a folder with meals. And so first let's use meal 1. So let's call it the meal image. And we also need to give it some alt text. So let's actually check out what this first recipe is all about. So this one is called Japanese gyozas or something like that. So let's actually just use this as the alt text here. Okay, so that's the image. And then we want the meal name. So for that, I'm going to use a paragraph, and again, not a heading element, because, well, this is not really a new subsection of this section, I would say. So just a generic paragraph is more than enough here. So calling this one meal title could have been meal name as well. And so again, using Japanese gyozas or something like that here. And then now we want to basically put these pieces of data. So let me copy all of it here so we have it handy. Okay, and so this kind of looks like a list, right? And so let's actually use an unordered list to mark up this content. So meal, let's say attributes. And then, as you already know, a list item for each of them. Now, when we have some pieces of data like these here to display, it looks kind of, well, let's say bad to just display it like this. So like writing what it is, and then like a colon, and then the actual value. So it's always better to try to put this content into some kind of short sentence. For example, saying 650 calories instead of saying number of calories and then colon 650. Okay, so this is a lot better like this. Now, as I said also before, here we are actually going to want some icon, but let's leave that for a bit later and first put our actual data here. All right. Now here actually let's give it a class as well. So let's call it meal attribute. So here we have the attributes, which is the list, and then each of them is a single attribute. Okay, and now I'm again duplicating this line a couple of times. So we have 650 calories. Then here we have this category of vegetarian. And remember how I mentioned way back in the component gallery lecture that categories are many times a good fit for using tags, right? And so here I'm actually going to add like a tag before this meal title here with vegetarian. And that's going to be even better here in the next one, because here we actually have two categories. And so then we can add two tags with vegan and paleo, and that will then make it visually very easy to understand exactly what category this recipe is in. And it's also visually a bit more interesting than having a huge list, right? So actually let's immediately do that. Put that right here. So for that, let me use a span element, because we might want to have multiple of them side by side. And also it's just like a single word. And so I think a generic span element is just fine. And so let me actually call it just tag, because we might want to reuse it at some other point in the page. So it is vegetarian. Okay, and so with that we have these two done. Next we have this thing which is the Nutri-Score, and here they tell us it is registered. And so we need that small r symbol. So I think you know what I mean. So that's the registered symbol. And for that, there is yet another HTML entity, which is the reg. And if we hover over it, yeah, there you can see it up there. Okay, so the Nutri-Score, and this is something that I made up, but let's just say that it's 74 here. And then we have the average rating. Okay, but there's no need to tell the user that this is an average. This is kind of obvious. And so let's say 4.9 rating. Okay, and then it's quite common to simply add the number of reviews or ratings between parentheses here. So no need to add a fourth row with that data. So these are kind of related, and so we're putting them all in the same row there. Okay, so this is our first draft of this card component, and if we need to add some more stuff, we can do that later, but as for the content, it's already all here. So let's quickly check it out here on the page. And as always, the first thing that we need to fix immediately is this huge image, because it actually makes our column here way bigger than it should actually be. So let's do that here, and it is called meal image. And so, as always, we want a width of 100%. And so, immediately, that is a lot better. All right, and now let's just quickly format this text content there. So that's the meal title. Let's give it a font size of 2 rem to start with. We also want the same dark color that we have been using for these kind of headings. Then a font weight of 600 also. And for now that looks good, I think, at least. And now let's style here the meal attribute. So not yet the, well, actually we can style both. So the meal attributes, which is the list, so that we can get rid of the bullet points, which is to say list style none. And then the individual ones, let's give them a font size of 1.8 rem. So probably these two here are not going to be enough, but let's just check that out. Yeah, this could be a little bit bigger, and of course we want some spacing after it as well. So the next step should be 2.4 and margin to the bottom of 3.2 rem, which again you could of course experiment with a little bit before arriving at that value. So that looks huge right now, but it will look okay once we also start adding some space between these lines here. And so let's actually do that. And in fact, I will do that again using Flexbox and the gap property. Okay, so instead of using margin to the bottom and then having to remove it in the last element, I will use Flexbox and changing the flex direction to column. So do you remember that? So I will just write it here now. And then just in case you don't remember what flex direction does, I will show you that slide again, maybe in case you skipped that lecture previously. So again, I will set the parent container of all these list elements between which I want some space to a flex container. So flex, right? But now they will be side by side by default, right? And so that's because, of course, by default, the flex direction is set to row, right? But we can change that. So we can set it to column. And so now it is, well, the other way around. So you see here now that these flex items are one after another. And so now when we apply the gap property, the gap will also no longer be applied horizontally, but vertically. And so let's do that. Let's say to rem, and that looks just fine. Okay. And just to make this crystal clear, because it is actually a very important part of Flexbox, I'm again showing you that animation where we switch from the beginning, which is what we have right here, to adding flex direction column. And so this again is the default, which is flex direction set to row. But then once we set it to column, it will look like this. Okay. And so the main axis now rotated 90 degrees, and the same thing for the cross axis. And so in this situation, the align items property will now align the items horizontally and not vertically, and also justify content does now align the items vertically. Okay. And finally, the gap property now acts a bit like the margin bottom property and no longer like the margin right. So basically, it applies the spacing now vertically and not horizontally. Okay, and now just to finish this first part, let's quickly add the icons here. So we want an icon for the calories, for the Nutri-Score, and also for the rating. Now we already used some icons before in the previous section, and those were the hero icons, right? Remember that? And with those icons, what we did was to simply copy the SVG code right into our HTML code, right? Now the problem with that approach is that it clutters up our HTML code a lot, and especially if we use a lot of icons. So at some point, it starts making our code a lot harder to understand than it should be. And so now we're actually going to use another type of icon. And so let me show that to you. So yeah, so remember we used to use the hero icons. So just in case you didn't watch the previous lectures, maybe. So here we would then simply copy the SVG and paste it. But now we're going to use an icon pack called ion icons. Okay, so these are the icons, so what they look like, and they are really nice and round, and I really like this icon pack for the way it looks like and how it integrates with many different design personalities. Now up here we have this usage link where we can basically read how we can use these icons. And what we want to do is this very basic usage. So for this usage, we need to copy this script here. So this is basically some JavaScript that we will integrate into our own page. And what this script will do is it will give us access to a special element called ion icon, right? And then there we simply can use the name with the icon that we want to use. And so that will then basically automatically inject the SVG into our page. And that probably sounds too complicated than it needs to be, but I just wanted to explain you how it works behind the scenes. So hopefully you copied that as well, and then just pasting it here right before this closing body tag. Okay. Now, if for some reason this page here looks very different by the time you're watching this video, and somehow you cannot find this script, and so this line of code here, you can simply pause the video now for a minute and type out this piece of code. Okay, so type it and paste it there at the end of the HTML exactly where I put it. Okay, and then we can simply come here to the icons, and then we can choose one that we like, let's say this one, and then all we have to do is to copy this code and paste it into our own code. Okay, so the first icon that we want is for calories, so that's some kind of energy, so I think like fire makes sense there, or a flame maybe, so I like this one here better. And so here we could actually also download the SVG, but again, we are actually interested in this. So we just need to click here, then it will automatically copy it. And then I just paste it right here. Okay, give it a save. And then right next to this element here, so this icon element here is of course not a standard HTML element. It is simply, as I just said before, basically created by this script that we passed into our page here. Okay, and so this then creates this custom HTML element which will hold our icon. Now, when we have an element containing something, then usually I like to have the text that is besides it also wrapped in some other element. So let's use a span element simply for that, right here. Just like this. And so this then makes it easier for us to, for example, align these two using Flexbox a bit later. Okay? So let's see how it looks like in our code. And to do this, I think we will have to manually reload now. Well, that didn't really work somehow. Let's see if our script is here. Yep, it is right here. But let's see here on our console. Oh, we see that there was some kind of error here for some reason. So let's maybe try to quit this here. So the live server, and then try it again. So go live again. And then let me reload that page here. And we still got the same error here, but actually off camera, I discovered that we need to use another version here. So basically, we right now are using 5.5.1, but we want to use 5.4.0, which is the version that I actually used previously. Okay, so if we give it a save now, then you see that the icon is actually here. And so even if it did work in your case, please make sure to also use version 5.4.0. All right. Now here we get this warning, which says that we should actually also use this script here. So if you also got this warning, then just go ahead and copy this and paste that right below this first one. All right. But if you didn't get this warning, then never mind. This is not something really important. Oh, and actually I didn't do as they tell us to do here. So instead, we should actually put this in the head. So let's grab these two here, copy them. Okay. Remove this from here. And put it right in the head. So put that here after the CSS. So you see that working with some third-party libraries like this actually is can sometimes take a little bit of time and be a bit difficult, but in the end, we can manage to do it, right? And again, if those errors didn't occur in your case, then you can just pause the video and write exactly what I have here. And just make sure to use these same version numbers. Okay, and so now everything is working. This script is doing its magic and it is injecting basically this flame icon into our code. And if we inspect this element, we can actually see that. So you see that this iron icon is now here. And then in there we have this strange thing, which is the shadow root. And then this is where the SVG lives. And so you see this looks a little bit similar to the SVG that we manually copied before. Right? But anyway, let's now just quickly take our remaining two icons so that we can then start styling this card. So here let's use like a fork or something. Well, maybe it's called cutlery. or maybe it's called food or eating. So sometimes we need to try a little bit until we find what we're looking for. So in this case, it's actually restaurant. Or if we don't want to search, we can of course also just manually go through these icons, which is actually what I did before this lecture. So to make it a bit faster to find it now. Okay. And again, let's then wrap the rest of the content here into a small span element. And then finally, the rating is usually associated with stars. And so let's use this one here. Just copy it, place that right there. Then it's annoying that it immediately creates the closing one that we don't want right there. But yeah. So with this, we should be good to go. We can close this one, but let's leave the rest of these tools here open as we keep needing them as we build the project. Okay, so we have our very basic card here. It still doesn't have a lot of formatting, and so let's take care of that in the next lecture.